Welcome to the third segment of my video series on writing a game book. We'll be starting off with talking about building a story arc. Now, this differs from when you create a story arc within a normal work of fiction. Within a normal work of fiction, a story arc might be the fall of your heroic character and their rise back up to good fortunes. For instance, when Conan of Aquilonia lost his kingdom, travelled across the country, managed to get some help and recover a magic item, and then recovered his kingdom. That would be a normal fictional story arc. What we're doing here within the game book context is slightly different. We're covering that and a good deal more. Let's take a look at this diagram. Now, what I've got here is a very simple story arc for a game book, and I've used this when I worked collaboratively with another writer. In this case, we divided the story that we were going to tell into 4 major segments. At the top here is the start of the story, which gives you 2 major branches or possibilities, and then underneath we both returned or wrote our way back to the central segment where we would end. So imagine, if you will, that this were that Conan story. At the top, that first blue circle would represent Conan losing his kingdom. The bottom circle represents him getting his kingdom back. But the 2 circles in the middle represent 2 major diversions of plot of the journey from him getting from the top to the bottom. So perhaps on the left, he takes a sea journey, joins up with some pirates, and perhaps on the right, he doesn't join up with some pirates. He goes across land and conquers a few villages on the way to get what he needs. That means that this final diagram actually represents our story arc and branches within that story arc. Now, these aren't individual entries within your gamebook, these are just major plot diversions. Each blue circle in this case may well represent a myriad of different entries or pages that you might have the reader turn to. Let's look at a slightly more complex story arc. Now here, all I've done is add another 2 blue circles, but there's a major difference in how the story arc will play out. For example, here, you can see there are 2 major segments or ways to end the story. Perhaps one might be a successful ending, and the other a failure. And if you look at the bottom right circle, you can actually see that there are 3 different paths that might be followed to reach it. So we've already created a more complex story arc. Let's look at something slightly more complicated. So here's a plot that's got 9 major segments to it. We've got a start, we've got a single endpoint, but immediately it branches out into 3 major diversions. Again, one could be a land route, one could be a sea route. The one on the right might be an underground route to whatever destination the hero's trying to reach. But what's especially important about looking and plotting out this diagram when you start is to conceive in your head at least how you can move from one major segment of the arc to another. Each of these arrows represents some major plot diversion, some division in the story. So it's at this stage, while you're outlining your story arc, that you have to at least conceive of how the plot might move from one circle to another. Because we're only outlining major plot points, if you like, you don't have to conceive of the actual phrase you're going to use or how one entry might link to another, but rather how the story could move from one situation to another. There's another feature that we can include in a story arc. Now, in this more complicated picture, you can see that I've included a maze over here on the left. You're able to move backwards and forwards between the different circles, between the different plot elements. If you imagine each of these circles represents a village or a town that our hero can go through, you can see that he can travel backwards and forwards. This might be necessary within your story structure. Perhaps your hero's trying to reach the South Pole, but he's got to go backwards and forwards getting more supplies in order to move the story forwards. Likewise, he might be getting lost in a desert, and therefore end up going backwards and forwards between the various locations in that desert. Let me reiterate here. Each blue circle actually represents an area or a segment of your plot. You're building the main structure of the game. You're not writing individual elements, so although I've described this as a maze, you wouldn't have each of these blue circles here representing a particular turning or a T-junction in a maze. These represent major plot elements, as I say. It could be his experience within a town, it could be his experience within a marsh, whatever. Wherever he is, each of these blue circles represents a number of entries and covers a whole plot segment. Let's go into a little more detail about these blue circles or areas of the plot. And let me tell you about my preferred plan. I like to write gamebooks with 400 odd entries in there. So that easily breaks down into 8 sections of 50 entries each. So each blue circle represents for me 50 entries. And I'll have 8 of those, which will build into a total of 400 entries. Once you've sketched out your story arc using this blue circle and arrow method, this is an ideal opportunity to consider rearranging those sections. Every time you have to make an edit, the earlier you can do it, the better, the less work you'll have to redo later on. So consider, would it be better for your hero to go through the mountains before he meets the cloud people, or perhaps after he's met the fish people? What you can do now is just resketch that plot arc and go over it again and consider what makes more plot sense. Consider all the possibilities as well. In the diagrams I've shown you here, I've created relatively wide structures, but there's no reason whatsoever that you couldn't arrange your segments to follow one behind the other. You could have major branches, as I've shown you here, or you could even have a circular structure if that fits the story or the method you want to use. In the next part of this video series, I'll be talking about how you start to plot one of those individual segments.